By the time I stood under the maple tree by the curb holding a box of kitchen knives, I already knew this neighborhood had a face and it was looking at me. I could see the way the houses leaned into perfection, the lawns like rehearsed applause, the mailboxes painted to the exact approved shade of colonial beige. Behind that perfection there was a small man in a golf cart who wore a look like he believed the world owed him exactness and obedience, and he was going to make sure he got both. That sight should have been my first warning, but instead it felt like a curiosity, a character in the little suburban play I had just bought my ticket for. I would later remember the way he said welcome as if it were a verdict, and how the first laugh we shared would be the last time I felt amused. I parked the moving truck, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked up the driveway with the smell of cardboard and lemon furniture polish in my nose. Everything smelled new and possible, like a life I had arranged with careful intent after years of renting and half-finished projects. I had spent months hunting for a place that felt like an anchor, a place quiet enough to think and loud enough to fill with friends and old records. My neighbor across the street had left a small note with a welcome cookie and a phone number scribbled in blue ink, a neighborly gesture that made me think this would be easy. Then the golf cart stopped, the clipboard appeared, and the cookie tasted like a setup. "Welcome to Fairgrove," he said, folding a paper like he was about to hand me a subpoena. He had a clipboard, a tie that tried too hard, and a posture like a man who measured himself in rule books. He introduced himself as Harold Finch. He didn't ask where I came from or whether I liked coffee, he told me the rules. He had a list of things I hadn't known existed: approved bulb wattage for porch lights, the precise Pantone for shutters, the approved height for hedges, and yes, the acceptable pattern for curtains when seen from the street. His smile was a scalpel. I tried to joke about the curtain thing and he didn't laugh. He tapped a pen against the paper and told me fines were not suggestions. There was something tiny and ridiculous that made me want to laugh then and there, a detail so petty it felt like a prank. He gestured toward my open living room window and said with a voice that made power sound like righteousness, "Make sure you switch those curtains. Not a problem now, but we are strict about community aesthetics." I told him mine were new, a soft off-white I liked, and he narrowed his eyes and said, "Off-white is as illegal as a barking dog on the third floor." His hands rearranged the air as if adjusting the neighborhood's teeth. I bristled because I value good taste and I value my own choices, but I shrugged and told him thanks anyway. The way you tell a storm you'll remember your umbrella. He handed me a stack of forms and a copy of the bylaws wrapped in plastic like it was a Bible. He handed it to me with the same expression a judge uses when he expects compliance. "Attendance at the annual meeting is mandatory," he read from a page, and then added without invitation that the community expected cooperation and alignment with established guidelines. Even then, I felt an electrical hum of wrongness under his words, a sense that rules were being used like a club. Behind his back, a small cluster of neighbors pretended not to watch. A woman hauling a garden hose looked away too quickly. A man with ragged hands pretended an expensive lawnmower needed immediate attention. Their faces said hello and also said keep your head down. I told myself I would be reasonable. I unpacked the boxes, put the curtains back up, and for the first night my house felt like a fortress of tentative hope. But that night I lay awake thinking about the clipboard and the smile, and a quiet fury grew in me that was part irritation and part fear. This place had rules, yes, but it had a sheriff with a badge of adhesive tape and a mouth that liked to read other people's lives aloud. For a weekend I did nothing but watch him patrol from my porch, like a man who arrives in a village and immediately senses a tyrant in the church tower. He walked the lanes in a khaki shirt, the clipboard a prop, stopping sometimes to write notes on perfectly trimmed grass like he was poeming in fractions. The next morning the cookie tray across the street was gone, and I found my neighbor's lawn sign stood oddly at an angle as if it had been tested for obedience. I realized then that this would not be a small annoyance to get used to. It would be a weather system. I would think later, much later, about how a man who measures curtains can also measure a life. I did not know then that his tiny rules were the instruments of a much louder machinery, that fines were not for grass but for gold, that a meeting would become a courtroom and a clipboard would become evidence. For now I kept my lights dim, my curtains down, and my eyes on the golf cart as it hummed past my house like a slow insect surveying the colony it owned. The envelope showed up on a Tuesday, heavy and official feeling in a way that made my heart jump for no good reason. I found it pinned to my front door under the porch light, the kind of placement that said someone wanted me to see it the second I walked in. The HOA seal stared up at me like an accusation, and inside, in type that looked like it had been photocopied from a bad legal template, was a violation notice. The offense listed was almost laughable until I saw the dollar amount. Curtain hue noncompliance, fine $450. It read like a prank, like someone had spent 45 seconds in a cruel imagination and hit send, but the signature at the bottom was Harold Finch's scrawl, authoritative and pleased. I walked around the house holding that paper like it might dissolve if I understood it wrong. The curtains I had chosen were the first thing I bought for this place after signing the papers and claiming the keys. They were off-white, warmer than the stark institutional white I hated, and matched the living room rug and the sunlight that fell across the floor at noon. I had laughed with the neighbor when he wrote his little welcome note about approved aesthetics, and I even joked with Harold that day about the curtains, like a casual thing between two people who didn't know each other yet. Now a man who introduces himself with a clipboard was telling me my taste qualified me for a fee that could buy me 2 months of groceries. I marched back to his golf cart as if I had somewhere to deliver a counterpunch, the violation folded in my pocket like a live thing. He looked up from a thermos and a spreadsheet app on his phone as I approached, the same tie, the same smugness. I received a notice, I said, and felt my voice wobble between disbelief and the kind of anger that smells like cold metal. Those curtains are brand new. There has to be some mistake. He smiled in a way that meant he was already done with me, like someone tolerating an insect buzzing too close to his light. Rules are rules, he said as if he'd recited it 1,000 times. You knew when you bought here. The shade is registered as ivory blush and yours reads as ocean fog. We have standards. I asked to appeal. If he had even the thinnest sliver of decency, he would have said yes and shrugged and told me where to find the approved fabric swatches, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned on the cart, clicked his pen the way someone ticks off bullets, and explained the appeals process in a voice that was all patronizing warmth. You can submit a written appeal, he said slowly, as if teaching me to solve a children's puzzle, but the board has discretion to deny appeals for frivolous arguments. That is your right, but understand that frivolous appeals often lead to administrative fees. He said the last part like a fable about consequences while watching me for a reaction. I felt small in front of him, like a kid being lectured for coloring outside the lines. When I pushed harder and asked politely where the fine money went, he cocked his head and told me in a tone of faux courtesy that the HOA financials were available, but only under very specific, heavily scheduled circumstances. Transparency is a process, he said, smiling as if he had taught me the mantra of sunlight through curtains. The impression I took away was not of a man guarding community funds so much as someone enjoying the feeling of guarding something. I left feeling as though I had hit a hidden fence and it had been electrified. That night I met the elderly woman from 2 houses down on her porch steps, her cardigan buttoned wrong and a manila envelope on her lap. She told me very quietly that Harold had fined her for having geraniums that bloomed in unapproved hues. The young couple across the street showed me their notice too. Their children's birthday banner had violated signage rules and cost them $200 because apparently helium-puffed letters were a crime against unity. The grumpy veteran from 3 doors over had been fined for a small flagpole that protruded outside permitted visual corridors, and he had a list of entries in a notebook where Harold had marked dates like a hunter tallying prey. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with each other about it at first, as if any spark could cause the whole neighborhood to combust. But we compared our pain like a secret recipe and found a common bitterness. I tried the internal appeals channel and got a form emailed back that read like a trap. It warned about retaliatory enforcement for continued noncompliance and required a notarized statement in triplicate. When I asked whether fines like mine were common, the reply was a single line from Harold himself, typed with an odd comm. This fine is not about the curtains, it's about conduct. Consider this a corrective measure. He meant it personally. Saying it out loud pried something open in my chest, a slow, hot band of truth. This was not rule enforcement, this was punishment disguised as governance. The thought twisted, ridiculous, and beautiful in equal measure. A man who uses a ruler not to measure what is but to shape who belongs. I remember standing at my kitchen counter that night with the notice in my hand, the room full of boxes and the quiet like an audience waiting for the act. Rage rippled through me, but underneath it was a sharper thing, curiosity. If the fine was personal, then the machinery behind it must have rules to hide behind. I started to look at the bylaws online, raw and ugly in their legalese. The first line I read said something boring about community standards and the board's authority, but then beneath the clauses that were supposed to be armor, I found tiny windows, the sort of technicalities an angry, patient person could crawl through. That night I did not sleep because the idea of letting a man punish me for taste felt like surrender, and surrender was not my thing. I taped the violation to my fridge like a challenge and decided that I would find every loophole Harold thought he'd buried. The first whisper came from a woman who lived across from the mailboxes and wore a sweater that had seen better winters. She folded her hands around a paper cup of coffee and said the word Leon like it was a threat you could taste. She told me about a man down the street who forgot to pull his trash can in for 11 minutes and ended up with a lien on his house for $600 in administrative recovery fees. Another neighbor chimed in about a flagpole rigged out of pride and wood that Harold declared non-compliant protrusion, and then placed a lien so the veteran would have to pay to remove it himself. The stories piled up like bad seasoning, each one small and absurd on its own, but together they made a stew of fear. I listened with my palms flat on my knees, a cold bubble of anger and curiosity rolling under my ribs because patterns reveal intent. I began to see Harold differently after those confessions, not merely as a petty man with a clipboard, but as a professional at corralling people. He had built a machine that made neighbors afraid to speak, afraid to fight, and afraid to show up. The young couple with 3 kids admitted they had never attended a meeting and paid fines quietly because Harold had once called their house in the middle of the night and left a voice message implying the board could make life complicated. The widow with the hydrangeas told me how Harold once laughed in a voicemail when she asked about where the fine money went. "It's for community upkeep," he said, as if the word upkeep were a talisman denying any follow-up. That laugh settled like frost on my spine. One late afternoon, I stood under the bare branches of a street oak while the grumpy veteran nudged a cigarette into life and showed me his notebook. Harold had marked dates and names with little check marks like a schedule of favors collected. There were line items people whispered about in curving circles: landscape maintenance, street improvement, holiday lighting. But when anyone asked for the receipts, the answer was always the same. The board would review requests in a closed session and release information only at the annual meeting when the financials were summarized for privacy. Privacy, it turned out, was Harold's favorite word when he wanted something to remain invisible. The veteran thumped the notebook and said something I hadn't expected. He suspected there were shell invoices paid to a company called Finch and Bloom, which no one had ever seen doing real work in the neighborhood. I started doing things I would have laughed at myself for before moving in. I sat in my car outside the clubhouse after dusk and watched cars leave with Harold in the passenger seat, his hand on a folder that looked like it carried the night's receipts. I checked property tax records online and followed a thread of payments in public records to an LLC that had an address 2 towns over. When I dug deeper, the LLC was registered under a woman named Lenora Finch, who I later learned was Harold's sister-in-law. The more I looked, the more a picture emerged that I did not want to like. Harold had built a small economy of favors, invoices, fines, and contractor payments that circled back to people he favored. People paid fines, fines paid contractors, contractors paid his friends. Nobody had a transparent ledger to prove otherwise. Rumors hardened into specifics in the kitchen of an elderly woman who smelled of lavender and old books. She told me about a gala Harold hosted the year before, billed as a community appreciation night, where the food was catered, the music was live, and the bill was charged to the HOA under outreach and appreciation. She showed me a faded photo on her phone of Harold in tuxedo cufflinks, laughing in a room with candles and crystal, and said he had taken the same table centerpiece home. She added with a dry smile that he had never once asked neighbors to show a receipt for the catering. It felt small and ugly, like a man eating the neighborhood's birthday cake and telling everyone they had paid. The strangest whisper was about Harold's binder. Neighbors described it in hushed tones, a heavy blue 3-ring filled with photographs of offenses, notes about meetings, and a column simply titled Compliance Score. People said he used it at morning shopping cart patrols, flicking to a picture and mouthing a name. A teenager down the road confessed she had once seen Harold outside her window, measuring the angle of a Halloween skeleton with a tape measure like a man calibrating a machine. He kept trophies, they said: broken ceramic gnome heads, a shredded party banner, a bent mailbox post, things he had collected after fines were paid. It was childish and menacing at once, like a villain in a storybook who saves the teeth of those he has punished. The fear was practical and mathematical. People stayed away from the annual meeting because silence bought them safety. Attendance had dwindled year after year, and with low turnout, Harold could rule as he pleased. When I asked whether anyone had ever seen a detailed financial report, the silence stretched longer than any sentence. Nobody had. The official summaries handed out were thin as a leaflet and full of vague categories. The bylaws mentioned audits and member access in language that felt purposefully dense, a maze to keep ordinary people lost. Somewhere in that maze there was a clause, the kind of clause that lets a determined person demand accountability, but I hadn't found it yet. I felt like a man who had stumbled into a closed theater and seen the ropes backstage. The show was not just about curtains, the backstage was where the money vanished. My anger sprouted claws, and I realized the next move had to be precision, not noise. I wrote the request the way my lawyer friend taught me to write hard letters, calm and with a citation. I sent an email and a certified letter asking for full and unredacted financial records, invoices, contracts, and check copies relating to HOA expenditures for the past 3 years. And I included a short note that under state law members are entitled to inspect records. When I hit send, I felt like a man who had stepped into a room with the lights on and a spotlight pointed at a figure who thought he hid in the dark. The letter should have been a simple bookkeeping request. Instead, it felt like a thrown gauntlet. Harold answered with delay and stagecraft. He emailed me back a week later with a calendar invite to review by appointment and attached a single spreadsheet that looked like a child's weather chart for community spending. The spreadsheet had vague categories and round numbers but no invoices, no payees, and no backup. When I asked for copies of the supporting invoices, he suggested we meet privately to talk it out, and he smiled like the world was a domino set he arranged. I politely refused the private meeting. Public funds deserve public scrutiny, and I wasn't going to hand him alone the moment to rewrite or destroy anything. So I did exactly what someone who does not know the law but knows how to dig does. I followed breadcrumbs in other public places. I drove down to the county recorder's office and sat beneath fluorescent lights with a stack of printed bylaws and a cheap cup of coffee. I asked for copies of contractor permits pulled for the neighborhood, and slowly a pattern appeared. There were dozens of permits listed as landscape repair and street tree maintenance with contractor names I did not recognize. Contractors who never parked a truck within a mile of Fairgrove and yet received checks for thousands of dollars. One company showed up again and again, Finch and Bloom Landscaping, billed for monthly seasonal displays on a line that should have read holiday lighting. Finch and Bloom, as it turned out, was registered to a woman named Lenora Finch at an address that matched Harold's family P.O. box. I kept digging through state business registration databases and found more names that repeated like bad pennies. A security firm called Oakwatch Services, quoted at pricey rates for camera installation to protect community assets, was registered to a single registered agent who also showed up on a small antiques dealer whose Instagram had photos of a chandelier Harold later posted a picture of at his summer home. Another business, Windsor Gateworks, billed the HOA for perimeter fencing, and in the county permit logs the fencing project linked to an address that belonged to Harold's property in the next town, a property he apparently never disclosed as related to HOA contracts. There were small, ugly details that made my stomach drop. The HOA minutes from a supposedly routine meeting had a line item approving a payment and listed a check number, but the attached supporting documents Harold gave me were clearly photocopied from different invoices. I found duplicates where the same invoice number paid the HOA and also appeared on a receipt posted publicly by a caterer from the gala Harold hosted that year. The numbers matched too neatly. It looked like invoices were being reused, redressed, and shuffled to make purchases that had nothing to do with the community look municipal. I started to notice the way transactions clustered around certain months, always when a holiday or public event was supposed to occur. Decorations and outreach ballooned in November, special projects spiked in April, and every time the treasurer's signature showed up it looked like a hurried scrawl. I found a scanned treasurer's signed ledger in an old email backup that had sections scratched out with a darker ink, as if someone wanted to make sure nobody read the flow of money too carefully. When I knocked on the treasurer's door, Marjorie, a soft-spoken woman who knitted in the clubhouse, looked at me with tired eyes and admitted she had been pressured to sign things she did not fully review. Her hands shook when she showed me a portion of the ledger she kept at home, and she whispered that Harold could be persuasive in private. The surprising twist that turned suspicion into something I could point at was a simple contractor invoice I found buried in a landfill of PDFs at the county building department website. It was an invoice for stormwater mitigation that had been paid by the HOA. The invoice number matched a check number recorded in the HOA minutes, and the payee of the invoice was a company whose owner, when cross-referenced with voter registration, turned out to be Harold himself under a different name. The invoice described work on a storm drain in Fairgrove, but the contractor permit and photos showed a new ornate water feature installed at an address tagged in the invoice that was Harold's weekend property. It wasn't accidental bookkeeping error. It was money rooted through conspiracy webs to buy Harold things. By the time I stacked photocopies on my kitchen table, the stack looked like a confession scribbled in ledger ink. I felt like a man holding a smoking gun whose owner might come back for it with more than words. It was one thing to prove a petty dictator measured curtains to crow about it. It was another to show that the same man was turning community coffers into his personal online shopping cart. I understood then that transparency would not arrive on a handshake. It would need a demand, a legal nudge that forced open doors Harold had kept bolted for years. I began to plan that nudge, quiet and precise, because a crowd storming a gate is different to a crowd presenting a paper trail in perfect order. I knew I could not shout and hope people would listen. Tyrants come cheap when everyone agrees silence is the price of living without hassle, and I was too wired to swallow that bargain. So I started quietly the way you would plan a small rescue. A text to the grumpy veteran asking if he wanted to grab coffee, a folded note slid under the widow's door with a time and an address, a message in the neighborhood mom Facebook group disguised as a question about holiday party volunteers. The meeting place was my garage at 9 on a Tuesday, lights low, boxes pushed against the walls like stage curtains. My heart hammered in my throat when they arrived, one by one, faces drawn, carrying the small, private weapons of people who had been bruised by bureaucracy. A stack of unpaid notices, a dog-eared notebook, a child's drawing of a ruined birthday banner taped to a complaint. We sat in folding chairs under the bare bulb and I felt, for the first time since the curtain's notice, something like possibility. I laid everything on the table like I was setting up props for a magic trick. The photocopies, the county permit sheets, the invoices with familiar names, the one invoice that matched Harold's check number and his weekend property photo. Marjorie the treasurer came in last, shoulders hunched and knuckles white, and when she set her ledger next to my stack I could see the tremor inside all of us. I started to speak the way it helps to speak when a plan is being born. Slow, steady, repeating the facts so they had time to sink in. I told them about the certified letter I had sent requesting records and about the vague spreadsheet Harold had offered in retort. I told them about Finch and Bloom and Oakwatch and Windsor Gateworks, and how those names mapped to properties 2 towns over, to an LLC with Harold's sister-in-law's name, to invoices that landed at Harold's weekend address. I watched the color leave people's faces in stages like a photograph developing. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the bylaws, highlighted and dog-eared where I had worked them into something usable. I said the word every small committee hopes is real: leverage. There was a clause, tucked behind page 12 in legalese nobody read the way they skip ads, that allowed owners to petition for an independent audit if a specified percentage of owners demanded it in writing. There was another clause that said members could call a special meeting with signatures from 20% of owners. I had also found a state statute online that required access to records within 10 business days of a written request, unless the board filed for a court order to prevent inspection. The law gave them procedures they had to follow. It did not give Harold a magic wand. It was technical and dry, but it was a blade in our hands if we used it right. My plan was surgical and ugly in its simplicity. Step 1, I said, was to build a petition that looked like a bank withdrawal. Precise, legal, impossible to ignore. We would get signatures from 25% of households, just enough to call a special meeting or at least force a response more official than Harold's Clipboard theatrics. Step 2 was to demand a full independent audit as a motion at the meeting, with copies of bank statements and contracts and vendor payments made available for inspection within the statutory window. Step 3 was contingency. If Harold refused inspection or delayed beyond the legal period, we would immediately file for a temporary restraining order with the county clerk to freeze HOA expenditures and prevent money from disappearing while the audit proceeded. I watched Marjorie's fingers tighten around her knitting and felt the room tilt toward resolve. I had recruited surprises into the plan like pocket aces. The grumpy veteran, it turned out, had been a civilian auditor for the Navy and could read a ledger like a map. The young mom had a kid who was a wizard at social live streaming, and she had already secured a friend at a local news site who smelled a story when neighbors got brave. The widow had kept every email she ever received from Harold and had an impeccable memory for dates and tone that could ruin Harold's practiced calm. I had talked to a lawyer friend who agreed to be on call for the day of the meeting and to file anything we needed to make our legal weight matter. We even had a teenager volunteer to fly a drone and capture the parking lot in case Harold tried to block people from entering the clubhouse. That last idea got a laugh, brief and hard, and then everyone went back to nodding like people who had already decided they were going to do what had to be done. The twist I had not expected until the pen was already in my hand came from Marjorie, who swallowed her fear and leaned forward. She told us, in a small voice like someone throwing a match in a dry field, that Harold had recently forged a letter claiming he had the treasurer's authority to allocate emergency funds to infrastructure improvements without board approval. The letter had been used to justify $3,000 in urgent repairs to the clubhouse roof that had never happened. If true, that forgery moved this from petty tyranny into a criminal layer, and it meant the audit we demanded could reveal not just sleight of hand but purpose. I felt the room shift as if a storm had folded open above us. We were no longer politely upset neighbors. We were a secret rebellion with a paper trail and a legal rope to pull. We left that night with rolls and numbers and a list of people to sign and phone calls to make. I taped a copy of the bylaws to my fridge like a call to arms and felt fear and exhilaration in equal parts. The annual meeting loomed in 3 weeks. Harold expected the usual crowd of the timid. He thought his grass would keep him safe. He had no idea a handful of us had learned how to read his maps. I was writing this here on Reddit because I wanted the world to know how small things build empires and how sometimes the loudest weapons are paper and persistence. The plan was in motion. The next move would be the meeting, and I could not tell yet whether the room would erupt or quietly change the locks on a tyrant. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and cheap perfume when Harold took the podium, his chest a little puffed as if he had been feeding on his own applause. He talked slow, the kind of slow that lets you think he is choosing his words like a sculptor instead of an executioner, and he smiled at every mention of stewardship as if it were his middle name. He thanked the small crowd for sustained cooperation. He read a long list of petty triumphs like they'd been festivals we had all attended, and he paused for dramatic effect when he announced a budget that, according to the thin summary in our hands, left more in the bank than anyone believed. There were muffled claps from a few people who had been coaxed to his side, and I felt my jaw tighten like a trap closing in my throat. I watched faces, tired, bored, resigned. I watched Harold with the same quiet anger I had when I first saw the curtains notice, but sharpened now into a kind of hard plan. When he asked for new business, I stood up, my chair scraping the linoleum like a drumbeat that made heads turn. I had rehearsed what to say until the words stopped feeling like words and became a direct route to truth. I cleared my throat and said the clause number aloud, the one tucked away in the bylaws like a sleeping dog no one dared wake, and explained that members had the right to request a full independent audit and copies of all supporting financial records under our state law. I said it slow and then faster until the sentence landed like a gavel. People started to stand behind me, one by one, not all at once, but like a tide rolling in. I could feel the room shift, the air making room for something bigger than our fear. Harold's smile flinched for the first time that night. The clipboard on the podium became a shield and then looked suddenly thin. "You can't just," he began, but there was no force in the words. I held up a stack of papers we had collected, the petitions signed by more than 25% of owners, neat signatures with addresses and dates. I said the words I'd practiced even more passionately than the clauses. We demanded an independent audit. I explained the motion simply, then read aloud the text of an emergency petition we had filed that morning with the county clerk, the same petition our lawyer had used to ask a judge for a preservation order to prevent further disbursements while the audit proceeded. I watched Harold's face go a color like an unripe apple. He barked for order and tried to call for a vote to adjourn, but that was the moment the room went loud in a way we hadn't rehearsed. People shouted our petition numbers, called out neighbors' names, and the camera on the live stream the teenager had set up captured every angle. The sheriff's cruiser that idled outside pulled into the parking lot like a punctuation mark. An officer I had met the week before because I had told him quietly what I thought might be happening, stepped in with a paper that bore a judge's signature. The preservation order was real and present in his hand, and the officer informed Harold in a voice that did not invite argument that the county had issued the order and that no transfers could be made from the HOA accounts pending the audit. Harold's reaction sent something sharp through the room. He tried to reach for his binder, that blue-ringed thing he loved to wave like a trophy, and Marjorie stood up so suddenly it looked like a kick. Her hands shook, but her voice did not when she said she had been forced to sign a letter that had not come from her. She told the room about the forged authorization and how numbers had been scratched out in ledgers. Her admission transformed murmurs into a wave. Harold tried to call a board member to corroborate, but our lawyer walked in at that point, calm and blunt, and announced he would be filing immediate motions to preserve records and to remove any officer who had acted outside authority. The most cinematic twist came when Harold lunged for the microphone, accusing us of a coup, but the room no longer listened to his performance. People who had been too scared to speak suddenly had the floor, and they told stories about liens slapped on seniors, about banners shredded by compliance officers, about quiet threats left in voicemails. Each story was a coin dropped into a clear jar. The jar was full and the truth clinked hard against glass. We called for a vote on the audit. It was messy and loud and beautiful. Half the room rose, more than half. We counted hands and voices until the chairman, a man Harold had appointed for decorum, looked down at the signatures I slid across the table and then at the judge-signed order on the sheriff's clipboard and said the word public officials dread. Passed. Harold's face became a map of small defeats. He tried to salvage dignity by proposing a private review, but the judge's order and the live stream made pretense impossible. The sheriff asked him to step aside and to hand over the binder and any electronic devices pertinent to HOA finances. He resisted with a thin, dangerous laugh, but handed them over when the officer explained the legal order. I felt a cold exhale as the binder changed hands, and the crowd realized a man who had wielded petty rules like clubs had nothing left but paper wrappers. We did not celebrate as if a war had ended because real work remained. We cheered in soft bursts, hugged, cried, and planned how to get an independent auditor appointed. Harold was escorted outside while neighbors recorded his exit, and the live stream caught his binder being bagged as evidence. I felt wild relief wash into my body like rain after drought, and beneath it, a small, raw grief for all the quiet years people had bowed their heads. I had not imagined the look on Harold's face as he walked out, no clipboard to hide behind. He had been made visible. The meeting closed with the sheriff reading the preservation order aloud, the binding of law louder than any clipboard. I left the podium with hands that trembled, but with the knowledge that the floor had been mine, and that the neighborhood had finally decided to stop fearing a man with a clipboard. When Harold slammed his palm on the podium and tried to call the meeting to order, I felt something in me go very calm. It was the kind of calm that comes from knowing you have already done the ugly work no one else would do. He barked that we were out of order, that no single member could append a board meeting with theatrics, and he started to flip through his blue binder like a man hunting a bullet in a haystack. I stood up and asked for the floor again, voice steady but loud enough to carry, and I read the bylaw out loud that mattered most. The clause allowing removal of a board member by majority vote of members present or by proxy at a duly called meeting. I had our petition slips in my hand, our lawyer at my shoulder, and the signed proxies tucked in my jacket like a secret weapon. Harold tried to smear us with accusations, called us a mob, said we were fomenting insurrection. He made a show of producing paperwork, a motion he claimed authorized several expenditures. That's when I pulled out the stack I had left on the table, the one that sat like a second heart under my sleeve. I showed the room invoices and canceled checks, copies of bank transfers, scanned PDFs with creation metadata that did not match the dates Harold had read off to the board. I projected a picture from my laptop onto the wall, a daytime shot of a cobblestone fountain installed at an address that matched one of the invoices. The invoice the HOA paid listed stormwater mitigation, but the photos showed an ornamental fountain and a monogrammed mailbox at Harold's weekend property. The room went very still, as if someone had turned the house lights off and left us in honest shadow. Marjorie, who had been treasurer and whose hands trembled whenever she spoke, came up to the mic. Her voice was small, but it cut like a file. She explained how Harold had pressed her to sign a letter that authorized emergency funds, that the letter had been dated differently from when she had actually signed, and that ledger entries had been altered in ink she did not recognize. I had a side-by-side copy of her original ledger page with her authentic handwriting next to the altered version Harold distributed. The signatures did not match. I let that hang there like a noose of ink. Then I played quietly a voicemail the young couple had rescued from their old phones, a clipped voice of Harold leaving an empty threat about consequences if they pushed back. People looked at Harold differently when they heard his recorded voice not polished for public consumption. The twist that emptied the room of pity and filled it with a hard demand came when the grumpy veteran stood and laid down something none of us expected. He had been a clerk for a local contractor once and kept correspondence he thought innocuous. He produced a text thread where a man with Harold's number arranged for special pickup, and a photo of a check with a faint imprint of Finch and Bloom on the back. Then we played the contractor's recorded statement we had secured with the help of our lawyer. The man admitted he had been paid by the HOA and had installed the decorative stonework not at the neighborhood common area but at a private estate that, when the GPS coordinates were revealed, matched Harold's weekend address. The giggling I had once heard from Harold at his gala felt small and obscene next to a man, admitting to being paid from communal funds to work on a single household's vanity project. He tried to claw back dignity by calling for a secret ballot, by insisting on procedural delays. That is when our lawyer stood and read the statute we had prepared, the one that said a vote could proceed by show of hands or by ballot, but only if a quorum existed and only if the matter was on the agenda. We had put the motion for a vote of no confidence on the floor under new business, exactly as the bylaws allowed. People began to sign their names to the motion publicly, and one by one neighbors stood and offered testimony about fines and liens that had been levied without proper documentation. The live stream captured everything, and the comment feed went from sleepy to volcanic in minutes. There was no orderly retreat for Harold. His allies shuffled like dry leaves. When the chairman called for a vote, I felt the world compressed to the sound of hands rising. We counted aloud methodically, and each hand that rose was an undoing of a small private tyranny. Some people cried, some cheered, and others sat stunned as if waking from a long sleep. The numbers were undeniable. The vote passed with a margin that would have embarrassed any dictator in a courtroom drama. Harold's face changed then, every line a map of surprise, anger, and finally a dull, private panic. He protested, he appealed to decorum, he accused us of playing politics while he led. Nobody listened. The sheriff who had been present for the preservation order stepped forward and with legal paperwork in hand, explained the immediate civil consequences and the need to hand over access to HOA accounts. The real kicker came after the vote when Harold, suddenly small, tried to reach into his jacket and pull out a paper that he claimed would exonerate him. A woman near the back laughed, a short bark, and walked up. Lenora Finch, whose name had been on an LLC we had exposed, stepped into the light and told the room in a voice I could have sworn was trembling a fraction that she had signed paperwork for a company because Harold had told her it was for legitimate vendors. She said she had never received payment and had not been involved in the contracts as a beneficiary. Her words unspooled like thread from a liar's coat. The crowd's mood shifted from triumph to a clear-eyed resolve. This was not a vendetta. This was a cleaning. We passed immediate motions to appoint an interim board, to freeze all accounts, and to initiate an independent audit with a firm we had pre-selected. I felt a wash of something like relief and then a raw, bright exhaustion in my bones. When Harold was escorted out, he left with his binder under his arm like a defeated prop. The room filled with the sound of people talking at once, planning how to return money, how to repair liens, how to forgive and rebuild, but also how to prosecute if needed. I sat down and let my knees give, feeling small and enormous at once. We had used bylaws, law, and ordinary stubbornness to unmake a petty kingdom. It was messy, it was noisy, and it was right. The vote had been more than a tally. It was a declaration that a neighborhood would no longer be someone's private treasury, and for the first time in years I felt the street outside my house breathe. The morning after the vote, the neighborhood felt different in a way that was almost ridiculous to explain, like waking to find the air inside a room fresh and new after a window slammed open. There was awkwardness too. Harold's absence left a hollow and a dozen small tasks that had been his little tyrant chores, approving a light bulb here, signing a parking waiver there, that now needed hands willing to do the boring work of real governing. I took one of those hands. The interim board asked me to join as a director. It felt equal parts honor and obligation. I said yes because I did not want the story to become a rerun with new faces. The first order of business in my new role was cruelty in paperwork, canceling the frivolous fines and starting the work of undoing what had been done. We convened with the auditor in the clubhouse that smelled mercifully of lemon cleaner instead of burnt coffee. The independent audit firm we had hired arrived with crates of binders and a grim patience. The audit was not neat. It was a slow, messy unspooling of receipts, fake invoices, and favors written as line items. The shocking part was not that Harold had stolen. It was how casually he had woven the theft into the daily life of the HOA, like a moth in a sweater. He had invoiced the HOA for seasonal lighting that lit his private gazebo, billed stormwater mitigation for a fountain on his private property, and paid outreach fees that were actually gala catering nights in tuxedos with his friends. The numbers were bigger than the whispers had said. We found payment chains that flowed into shell companies, then into local businesses that issued checks back to Harold under different names. It was not mere kleptocracy. It was a small economy Harold had invented for himself. There was a twist in the ledger that knocked out any easy narrative. An unrecorded wire transfer had been made to an out-of-state trust the week Harold sold some old playground equipment from the HOA storage. The equipment had been removed at night with no note and later appeared on a resale site listed at 3 times the price. The audit traced that wire to an online payment processor tied to an account in the Caribbean. That discovery opened doors with the county prosecutor, who moved quickly and quietly with subpoenas and freeze orders. The prosecutor's office handed the case to state investigators who were not interested in polite language. They wanted proof, receipts, and a chain of custody. Our binder, the blue 3-ring Harold had used like armor, became evidence filed at the courthouse in a glossy stack. What surprised me most emotionally was how many people came forward when they finally felt safe enough to speak. Lenora Finch, who had been named on several LLCs, sat in the clubhouse and told us she had signed papers because she trusted Harold as family and had not realized the invoices were fake. Marjorie, who had once nearly fainted under the weight of guilt for signing things she did not understand, handed over an envelope with ledger pages she'd kept hidden in a cedar chest. The grumpy veteran handed a jar of nails he had pried from a decorative garden statue that Harold had paid for and suspected was removed from the common area. These small acts of courage threaded into a bigger picture and gave the prosecutor the corroboration needed to indict Harold on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. When the arrest warrant came, it was almost anticlimactic. He was taken at his weekend property, packing a duffel bag, phone buzzing with calls he ignored. The sheriff read the charges aloud like a dial tone. In court, the prosecutor laid out a paper trail that was precise, unflinching, and thorough. The judge froze HOA assets, and a receiver was appointed to oversee recovery efforts. It took months, and recovery was partial. Some funds were gone, some vendors refused to cooperate, others had already been paid and spent. We recovered enough that the most punitive liens were rescinded, several families were reimbursed for fines that had bankrupted them, and a restoration fund was created to repair the lawn where the stormwater fountain had once been. It was imperfect justice, but it was justice. On the new board, we rewrote rules as if we were building a house rather than a stage set. We added mandatory quarterly audits, an online transparency portal where bank statements and contracts were posted in full, and a conflict of interest policy that would make any future Harvey Finches think twice. We eliminated petty fines for aesthetic choices and replaced them with clear, narrowly defined rules enforced with warning-first policies. We created an emergency contact line to protect seniors and a community grant to help neighbors who had been hit hardest by Harold's wrathful ledger. We voted, unanimously and loudly, to return the clubhouse key to the people it had always been meant for. The best twist was not legal. It was human. The widow who once closed her curtains and kept to herself started a weekly coffee hour in the common garden. The young family threw neighborhood potlucks where last year there had been only fear. The grumpy veteran and I painted the old bench by the mailboxes, and kids who had learned to step around the pattern of avoidance on their street now ran through it like it belonged to them. I found myself standing on my porch one late afternoon, curtains pushed back, watching neighbors as they traded tools and stories, and I felt the kind of satisfaction that tastes like clean iron and sunlight. Harold still faces trial, and I do not exult in his downfall because I know collapse is complicated and cruelty leaves scars. What I am proud of is the neighborhood we rebuilt from the rubble he left behind, transparent, messy, accountable, and alive. We canceled petty fines, cleared wrongful liens, and planted an oak where the fountain used to mock us. On quiet nights, I still check the street, not with the prickly watchfulness I once wore, but with ordinary watchful care. The curtains hang now in a color I chose, not one that was approved by a self-made tyrant, and when the blinds lift in the morning, the neighborhood seems to breathe open with me.